Where's the, does it have to go up? I'll just hold it.
Oh, it's this way. There you go.
Oh. So, just a couple newsy items to start. You should know that at the last annual meeting of the Nova Scotia Bird Society, that was in November, 2 people were nominated and elected to the board from Southwest Nova Scotia, and be Alex and myself. So we now officially have representation on the board of directors from this area. Were you at one time on the board? You've never been? So it's not very often that we get a director down here, I don't think.
Well, we had Charlie Allen for the stops, and they were on
For a long time.
for a long time.
Yeah.
That was a long time ago.
And that was a long time ago,
I don't
yeah.
think we've had anybody.
Since him. Yeah. Okay. So we're turning things around.
What does that mean in practical terms?
In practical terms, well, one is something I'm going to discuss next, but it means that we have a vote and input on the Bird Society province-wide. And we can also represent the interests of Southwest Nova Scotia. If you want to represent the interests of Southwest Nova Scotia, it's best to have somebody from Southwest Nova Scotia on the board.
Yeah.
So,
Involves you in traveling for meetings, though?
no, we can do it by teleconferencing. Yeah. But one example of what can result is that every year the Bird Society has one meeting outside of Halifax. Last year it was in Cape Breton, I believe. The year before that, or maybe it was 2 years before that, it was in Amherst. And this year they want to have it in Southwest Nova Scotia. So that means usually there's good turnout for that out-of-town meeting. People from all over the province will be coming here for a meeting. It lasts the whole weekend, and it involves meetings like this, but also field trips. And no, sometime in June. I'm aiming for around the 3rd weekend in June. What's your way?
Probably be away this is the weekend.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Alex is organizing is in the early stages of organizing a tour of Tuscan Islands. Do you want to say that? Say what you're doing?
Be with Tuscan Island Tours out of Wedgeport, hopefully going from the Wedgeport area through the Tuscan Islands and then to Green Island to see the puffins and yebirds and razorbacks.
One guy.
Maybe.
And one usually there.
What's that?
That one guy sits there.
One of the reasons we're looking at that time of the month is that earlier in the month, some of us have to do breeding bird surveys on the weekends. And because we're not able to do them during the week, you have to do them on the weekends. And also probably in terms of the birds on the Tuscan Islands, breeding that 3rd week in June is probably more ideal than earlier in the month. So, anything else people want to bring up? Besides, thank you for coming out in this frigid, cold weather tonight. Just so Jake knows, we have these many chairs out because that's pretty well what we normally get. So that's the kind of weather effect we've had tonight. But our speaker tonight is Jake Walker. He's a researcher in the biology department at Acadia University. He drove all the way down here through this bad weather for this meeting tonight. His current projects include using radar to track movements of birds near renewable energy developments and using EBird data to model population trends. Jake received a B.Sc, a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from Cornell University and studied American woodcock breeding phenology for his Master's of Science at Trent University. Jake is a lifelong birder, but has only lived in Nova Scotia since 2014. Previous bird studies have taken him from the Bayous of Mississippi to the Hudson Bay. Jake currently volunteers as one of the eBird reviewers. He probably knows some of the birds that you've seen, at least the rare ones, and serves on the board of the Blomidon Naturalist Society. So thank you very much for coming, Jake.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh.
Is that close enough? All right, so I was kind of wondering just to begin with, like how many, I know everybody over here has probably used eBird before, but on this side of the room, has everybody used eBird before? Or maybe a little bit? No? Rare bird alerts? Okay, good. Then I should have a lot to show you tonight. So eBird, to begin with, was launched in 2002. And it kind of evolved out of Project Feeder Watch. So this is something that started even back in the 1970s. It started in Ontario at Long Point Bird Observatory, where they tried to get a lot of local people that had bird feeders to keep track of what they were seeing at their feeders and kind of compile it in one location. And that project over the years got larger and larger, and Cornell got involved and kind of, as the internet was getting more useful, and started making a site where they could compile just huge amounts of information from all these different feeder watchers. And eBird is more or less the same thing, except for it just takes in all bird watching activities. So yeah, I was at Cornell at about that time. I graduated in 2001. It was launched in 2002, but I studied birds when I was there. And kind of, we were all talking about it, and the professors were that, you know, with the internet, it would be really great if we could get all these bird watchers, like amateur bird watchers and professional ornithologists, and just kind of compile all their notes into one place to create this really big database. And that's what eBird is. Like, a lot of people see it as something else, like maybe it's a tool for listing or just a way to like kind of plan your birding trips. But really, overall, it's just supposed to be this database just to collect all this information that was otherwise getting lost. So, I mean, before people would make notes in their notebooks, and, you know, who knows what happens as they passed away. I mean, it might get deposited in a museum, they might get thrown away, but for the most part, they were lost and more or less inaccessible to scientists and to other bird watchers. So eBird was launched in 2002. It took off pretty slowly. Like, I didn't actually hear about it until 2004, even though I had been at Cornell and I knew some of the people that were involved in creating it. It took me a while to find it, and actually found it on the Massachusetts Audubon Society webpage. I was working in Massachusetts at the time, studying shorebirds. But as soon as I saw it, I said, oh, this is a great idea, and I started using it. And it kind of forced me to change how I was birding a little bit. So a lot of people back then, and even now, when they go out birding, they might keep a day list. That happened most of the time. So you go out birding for the whole day, you'd visit a whole bunch of different locations, and you kind of create a list for the whole day. And you might make notes of like where you picked up new species, but for the most part, it covered a whole bunch of different areas. And so eBird, right off the bat, they wanted it to be location specific. So they really wanted to kind of narrow it down to have it like site specific checklist. And so it was kind of a pain at first to start doing that and kind of change like my birding ways. You have to enter more checklists over the course of a day, but you get so much more information because all those common species that you might have on your list, but you don't really know where they were. You might know where the rare ones were, but the common ones were just kind of getting lost in there. So it's just a way to compile all that. So it's a very slow start. Didn't really take off until around 2010. And that's when they kind of made a global project. It started in just the US and Canada, and then they kind of went to Mexico, and then through the Americas. Then they added the rest of the world. And then they also added a whole bunch of other ways to explore the data, like a bunch of mapping features. And then what really made it take off is when they added the top 100 to get into this kind of competitive bird listing. So really that's what did it. As soon as they put that in there and added some competitive aspect to it, then the birders really took to it and started entering tons of checklists. So that's kind of how it got started. Then I'll just show you a little bit about different ways to explore the data first. I'm kind of have to be based here, unfortunately, to operate the computer. But so this is the eBird homepage. Now it goes right to this page that has some of your own stats. So this would be like my stats right here. And then some different news items that would have down there. So just going into exploring the data, this is actually all really new. They just added these things recently, like explore species and explore regions are the two newest things they added. They're pretty handy ways to look at some of the data that's in there. So say for explore species, you can just type in any species in the world, say like a slaty-backed gull. It's on my mind right now. And so there, you get this. It has several key photos in different ages. A little bit of my stats. I've seen one before up in Nome, Alaska, but I don't have any photographs of it. And a little blurb about the species. Then down here is where you get into some of the more interesting stuff. So these are all the observations of slaty-backed gull. So there's 6,795 observations worldwide, 1,100 with photos, and then you can get into the individual observations by looking at the maps. You can see where this species is normally found, which is over in this area, and then there's quite a few in Alaska, so mine was right around there somewhere. And then recently, they started showing up all over in North America. And this is more of a recent phenomenon. Maybe it was happening before and they were overlooked, but it definitely seems like there are more and more of them showing up. And then, so you can click this show point sooner, and then as you zoom in, you'll see the individual records. And everything in red are birds that were seen within the past 30 days. And all the blue ones are just other older sightings. So you can see where they are right now. So there's this one that Mark found yesterday, and then there's a few other ones in eastern North America and a couple in California. And then you can look at something else that's like, say, a lot more common. Oops, can't type. Still can't type. And then you have these, what are essentially becoming like real range maps for these birds. I mean, before it was kind of just like an outline that was drawn on a map, but these are all just like our real sightings. So there's not a lot of information up in here because there aren't bird watchers up in these areas, but down where there are a lot of people, then you get pretty good data. And then as you zoom in further, you get the individual records. So I think you can map 2,000 individual records on a page, so you have to zoom in pretty far or something like that to get even further, I guess. But anyway, and then if you want to see ones with photos, you can click on that, and then it shows you all the ones that have photos or video. And you get into these individual checklists of what people have seen. So that's just one way of looking at some of the data if you're interested in one species in particular. And this regions I find is pretty handy. it's relatively new. It's probably about a year old now, I guess. So it just gives you quite a bit of information about Nova Scotia. There's 450 species recorded in eBird. We're up to almost 160,000 checklists in Nova Scotia. This is just skyrocketing. Just a few years ago, it was half that. So yeah, there's tons of data in there now. You can look at it by counties. You can sort by county and see how many species are in each one. If you click on an individual county, it'll give you more detailed information about that county. You can look at recent checklists. So this is each species, which, the ones that have, when it was most recently seen. You can sort that by when it was first seen or see high counts of that species, or you can go into the bar charts for the county, which is the frequency histograms for the county and how common things are. Then it has the listing aspect, shows you the top listers in the county, and then the top birding locations. And there's also this really nice thing they added pretty recently too, called the illustrated checklist, which takes the bar charts that they had before that show the frequencies, and then it adds on photos of each bird too, and a little bit more information about it, so you can kind of see when you might be likely to see a snow goose in Yarmouth County or a greater white-fronted goose. And so that you can do pretty much anywhere in the world. I mean, you can't get down to the county level in some jurisdictions because they might not have counties in some other countries. It might just be down to the province or state level or something like that. But where they have counties, you'll get down. You can show the individual plots for those counties. And so, what happened to my bar charts? I guess they just have the bar charts in the counties. They're not in Nova Scotia. So there's a link to these bar charts. This was like the first display output they had in eBird. So this is what, usually when I go to look at a place, I just go straight to the bar chart. Then it always linked to everything else. So this is the bar chart for Yarmouth County, 373 species. It says here, and then you can see just basically how common everything is. And this just takes frequency of observation into account. It doesn't take the numbers into account when looking at this, but so you can look at any of these species and get a lot more detailed information. So you can take wood duck, so you can pull up the map and see where they've been seen, which is none yet this year. And then they have these other line graphs, which can be useful, especially for seeing kind of when things return. The frequency is, but these could be, depending on how much data is in eBird, like for in Yarmouth County, there's maybe not quite enough to get a nice smooth line graph here. Maybe it's a little bit better for abundance, not really. So I guess I picked not the best species probably, but you can look with Canada goose, maybe it'd be a bit better. So you can see when there are the most Canada geese around. You can look at high counts, different ways of looking at the data to see kind of when the largest flocks of Canada geese are around. And if anybody has questions, just please stop me at any time. I mean, this is for you guys, so if you have questions about any of this, please ask. Yeah, all right.
Average count, is that average including 0 checklists? I mean, does it include checklists where that bird was 0?
For the average count, it should say on the bottom. So yeah, so there's usually a little link to say what these different metrics are. So yeah, so it's all with a positive observation. So it does not include the 0 count. So yeah, so it's basically flock size.
I have a question about the sub 100.
Yes.
Why does it show on the validation records?
Well, yeah, because
Is it a legal situation? I can understand that.
no, I guess that's always been eBird's policy. They really didn't want to be like the bird police, you know, they wanted people to be able to count a bird whether or not it was validated. So they still let people count it, even though it's not a valid record. So, yeah, just so there weren't any real bad feelings. So people are like, yeah, I mean, it won't be in the public data set, but, you know, you can still count it. It will still count on there.
Why don't they have two sets?
Yeah, I don't know.
Top 100 general and then a top 100 validated.
Yeah, there is a lot of talk about that, like on the eBird regional editors list of trying to go that direction, because there is, you know, some people don't play by the rules. So, I mean, for the most part, it's good, but yeah, there's some people that really get into the competitive listing, and you know, they take things to the next level.
What does constitute validation?
I'll get into that in a little while. So, yeah, I could do that right now. I was going to talk about submitting records first, and then I'll get into the review process. So yeah, so all the eBird records are reviewed to a certain extent. It all passes through a filter, and yeah, I'll actually show you the filters in a little while. So. Right, I'll go back to Explore Data. So these were those two things. I mean, they all kind of link into each other now. So I mean, by looking at Explore Species and Explore Regions, we've already looked at the bar charts and the species maps and a little bit with the photos. I didn't get into the hotspots. So a hotspot in eBird is basically just a public birding location. It doesn't necessarily have to be a location that has a lot of birds. It's just anywhere where birders can go and watch birds. They're not private property typically, unless the landowner is, you know, allows people there normally. Yeah.
I think I remember someone talking about the area hotspots a few years ago. Has that gone anywhere? Or have they...
It hasn't gone anywhere yet. Yeah, so right now a hotspot is just pinned at one location, so it just has coordinates for that hotspot, and then it compiles lists from different observers that go there. In the future, they kind of want to map out polygons, so just like a shape, so any checklist that falls within that will get compiled to the same hotspot. But I think it's just a lot of work to get all the boundaries for those together, so I think they started with it. They've done a little bit of that for some of the filters, especially with topography, looking at, you know, elevations. So they have polygons for different elevations, and we'll use that some, but they haven't got into it for the hotspots yet. I think they do still want to go that direction, but it's not there. Yeah.
With the tracks now too, to complicate matters.
Yes. So these are the maps. So this is basically each square has a certain number of species in it. Each grid cell says the number of species, and you can zoom in on it if you want to see good spots to go birding in your area, at least where other bird watchers have been. So I mean, there's some areas might not have any. Like there's a few places here that are pretty hard to access. There are no hotspots there. And then you can click on any of these hotspots and just pull up a list of what has been seen there. So there's that. So there's the bar. So you could do the number of species. You can do the view details, which gives you something very similar to that Explore region thing. So you can see at this hotspot, there's 207 species, 539 checklists. When species were first and last seen, a list of the recent visits, then even an illustrated checklist that has locations, I think that's specifically to that spot, isn't it? So it's all pretty neat.
I've got a question about the species data.
Yes.
What's the logic behind the sensitive species master?
Well, yeah, there's a number of species that were in there. I mean, there's a few certain cases where hunters had used eBird to find specific birds and targeted them. It's also a problem in the pet trade, especially with parrots, where they found out that trappers were actually using eBird data to go and trap certain kinds of parrots. So for parrots, that's a thing. It's also with falcons.
I just heard that on the radio tonight.
So is that why
Stealing eggs and bringing them to
gyrfalcon
the UK.
is restricted?
That's why gyrfalcon is restricted, yeah. Cause
What's the logic with the time period? Because it seems to be back years and years and years and not to a relevant point. You know, you can understand if it's like within 3 or 5 years of a wintering gyrfalcon because they move after.
Right. I mean, they said that they're going to change it down the road and like make it different for just in different regions. Right now, they just put it like a global thing on there. If that species is sensitive, they're just going to make it so you can only see it kind of at, you know, like this scale. You'd be able to see the map. You wouldn't be able to see specific locations where it was reported.
You know, if it came up like you get all that stuff, news, we're doing it because parrots are being targeted and the falcon are being targeted, and hunters are, they're going to infiltrate the same as we infiltrate theirs.
Yes.
It's the same thing. But it needs to be said in black and white so people can, instead of moaning about it on Facebook, we actually understand why it's happening.
Right. Yeah, and then for, you know, owls, it's kind of the same thing. It's not so much trapping for owls, but more that they can be disturbed by photographers. Although I think it's funny they don't have long-eared owl as a sensitive species. It's probably the most sensitive owl around, but that's the one that's not on there. But I don't know.
They do have all this stuff in the document, but like a lot of things with eBird help, it's not that easy to find.
Right. So that's something, I mean, actually, I was pestering about that quite a bit when I lived in Ottawa, because it was really bad with the owls there and the photographers. I mean, they would chase them out of every tree, you know, and just,
They would be doing it in one place.
Yeah.
They didn't know about all the other owls that were around.
Right, that's right, because there was like the whole secret bird listserv that the photographers wouldn't get on. But anyway, but yeah, that's the sensitive species bit. So I covered most of these main data search things. Then there's the search photos and sound. So they added photo embedding pretty recently. I mean, that was, I don't know, when did they start that? About 3 years ago, maybe? But they've already compiled 10 million photos of birds around the world and 415,000 audio recordings and almost 60,000 videos.
Are they going to open up video uploading to the general public at some point?
Probably. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there's issues there with size. They don't want people to just upload any kind of video because they could be just, it could be huge. I know, yeah. So I'm not sure what their plan is for that exactly, but so you can search any species in the world in here. And I think they have photos of pretty much everything now. I mean, there's a few missing, but yeah, pretty much anything you want. So that's some of the data that's available in eBird just to browse through. So I mean, I can get lost in here very easily, just kind of looking around at different species and bar charts from different areas. So I'll just get into submitting the data. So I mean, this is all data that individuals have submitted for the most part. I mean, there's a few data sets that have been uploaded into eBird. Like some of the breeding bird survey has been put in there and some other things, but mostly it's just individual birders have put in checklists. And there's about, I can't remember what it is now. It's on that main page, I think just over 30 million checklists in eBird now. So I'm going to show you how to submit a checklist. So I'll do this, find it on a map. So I'll put in children. It's because I was birding down there earlier today for a bit. So you can zoom in on any area by kind of clicking on these plus signs. And so the red spots are hotspots. So these are the pre-existing public locations that are in there. So if you actually birded at one of these spots, you should pick one of these locations. If you're birding somewhere, so these blue ones are other personal locations that I've put in different trips I've made down to Cape Sable Island. Yeah, that's Johnny's house. So yeah, it should probably be a hotspot. Yeah, so I was birding here, looking for the gull, the slaty-backed gull. I have already put in a checklist, but I was going to show you. So if there were another point, say this one, what's that? Is that Kenny Road? So if you're going to put in a new location for there, I'll have to zoom in a little bit more. And you think it should be a hotspot, which maybe it should. So as soon as you put it in, you would put in a name that other bird watchers would recognize it by and just click this box, which is suggest hotspot. And then it sends an email to the review basically, and then it says like this should be a public birding location, and then somebody has to accept it. So if you are going to do that, make sure you name it something where people can kind of know what it is. It's not really meant for, you know, your yard or anything like that. A lot of people put those in there. That's mostly the ones that I have to deal with. They're just people's yards they put in for some reason. And some are other just like kind of random road names I don't know about. So just.
Why am I on it, Jake?
What's that?
Why am I there?
It says Mark Dennis number 9.
You know, that's something from Google Maps, I think.
You added it by accident, honest.
It's something you put in on Google Maps somehow. I don't know.
Yeah, there it is. You put a sticker there. When the hell did I do that?
Yeah, I've noticed that before.
He owns the whole place, you see. You don't realise that the entire island is his.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm in Google Maps now. But anyway, so I'm not going to do a personal location because I was down at that hotspot, but that's how to suggest a hotspot. There's another way to get at it too. If you've already entered a checklist from a personal location and after the fact want to make it a hotspot, you can still do it, but it's a little bit harder to get at. Okay, so this is where I was birding. You can click here just to get today's date, just on the little calendar. And so when they made eBird, they really wanted to make very general protocol types to get, you know, most bird watchers' activities to fall into these protocols. So the first off is traveling. Most birding should fall into that category. You're walking around outside, you're looking at birds. And so the main things you need for that, you need a start time, you need the distance you've traveled, the duration, and how many people you were with. And that's basically it. But for the traveling distance, it's important that if you're walking on a one-way trail, it's supposed to be the one-way distance, not the round-trip distance. So you just calculate the one way. And that's one thing. If you're using the Bird app, you are supposed to cut the distance in half if you're on a one-way one, because it will do the round-trip distance on there. So it's kind of a nuisance. They just decided on that right off the bat. That's the way they were going to do it. And so that's the way people are supposed to. I'd say probably only about half of people actually do it that way, though.
Yeah,
So there's a huge amount of error there, but that's okay. And then so stationary count is if you're not moving or you move just a short distance. They say within about 30 meters or so. But yeah, if you're like watching your feeders or something, stationary count is a perfect count for that. Or if you're doing a big sit, or if you're just doing a relatively short checklist. They do recommend that most stationary counts be at least 3 minutes, just because in shorter counts you don't really pick up a whole lot of birds, but you can enter shorter ones in there, but they do recommend 3 minutes. And the same with traveling counts. They really want short distance checklists. They're looking for checklists 8 kilometers or shorter, ideally. And that really helps with their habitat mapping. But you can certainly put in longer lists.
What do you put in if you've been birding out of your window most of the day?
Yes, so that's an important question, because you used to be able to do that as incidental, where you're not really. So it says that the description is kind of funny. Birding was not your primary purpose, but it might have been, but noting a bird while driving or gardening. But if you've been watching all day, but you don't really, so it's not really a stationary count unless you were like actually there watching the whole time. But if you keep coming back to look, the best way to enter that is actually a historical checklist now. It just seems a little bit odd. Yeah, because, incidental now will only allow you to do an incomplete checklist. So incomplete means that you're not reporting every single species that you identified. Like there might be some you left off. Like if you didn't want to put crows or starlings on there because you didn't care, then that would be an incomplete list. But it's still better to keep that complete list. So they actually recommend, it's buried deep in their protocols, that they use a historical list for that. So you put on the start time and the date. For the distance and area would be 0 for that. And you just have. And you might even have the duration not actually fill in that field, just the start time, because the duration is kind of hard to judge how long you were actually watching. But then you can still put a complete list in there, and that's actually really important for the type of modeling I do. It's much better to have those complete lists in there than an incomplete list.
So you put it underneath historical?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question about
areas, let's say, I don't know if you know, the Cook's Beach, Pygmy's Point,
Oh.
Marsh
I don't.
area. Cook's Beach is a totally different habitat, but it all comes under the umbrella of one area.
Yes, yeah.
Change it, put a pin.
Yeah, we've
I
got-
did put a pin at Cook's Beach, and it's been accepted as a hotspot. There's a little red
Yeah.
thingy there.
So there's a Pinckney's Point hotspot, right? And if you consider that to be the community of Pinckney's Point.
Yeah, I don't
it
consider that to be
encompasses
the
Cook's
marsh.
Beach. Right, so.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the more detail in there, the better. So, I mean, you should suggest them. I mean, there's a big list of ones I have to go through right now,
There
but
should be almost an area to describe the hotspots.
there should be, yeah, that's something, there's a lot of chatter about too.
Beach on the hotspot now?
Yeah, there's
On-
a Cook's Beach hotspot
There is
specifically
one.
for Cook's
I
Beach.
did put that in for you.
Oh, yeah, okay. So what Pinckney's Point then? It's
Yeah, there's that one as well.
So when you're in the marshes, on this
On the
side
marsh,
of
you're
the
in
bigger
Pygmy's-
rock wall,
Yeah.
are you at the Cook's Beach one,
Beach.
or are you at the Pygmy's Point?
Pinckney's
Yeah.
Point.
That's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure out.
Yeah, well, that's something, I mean, whoever, if you're the one birding that the most, or, people that you know, you should talk about it, and then send me an email or send Dominic an email. We deal with a lot of the hotspot stuff.
There's a few that we have to fix, like Cape for Shoe, we have Thomas Road. Then we have a Cape for
Jerry
Shoe
Lake,
Point
and then Jerry
near
Lake.
the lighthouse.
Right.
Right, so, and there's a bunch of stuff that we should fix, and sooner rather than later is.
Yeah, a lot of it was inherited from old stuff where it was made, like each peninsula kind of had their own
Yeah.
hotspot, but it didn't have like sub hotspots or little locations within that peninsula, but now it's better to have that, so.
Can
But
you
yeah.
suggest to eBird to add certain things? Can we suggest to have a description of a hotspot?
It's been suggested many times, yeah. Yeah, no, I think it is something they want to do, especially when they add those polygons. I think they're also going to add that and have a description for each hotspot. They've already done it in some of the states in the US, like just the editors there have done it on their own time. They just put together a web page that has a description of each hotspot and how to use it. So yeah, so we're not there yet. I don't have time for that, but some people, some people might.
So those are my hotspots for our birds.
Yeah. All right, anyway, so I was there at Swims Point. I'm just getting a little bit sidetracked there. So yeah, I think I talked about most of the ones I wanted to. So there's the historical one. So yeah, so like a lot of older lists or longer lists, maybe from a whole day trip. But yeah, they don't really know maybe how far they traveled or how much time they spent or something's missing. So you can't use the traveling count because you don't know exactly how much time was. So that's what this historic one was mostly for. So you can just enter whatever information you have. You don't even need any of it. All you need is a date.
How does the use of the checklist that's set as historical differ from stationary or traveling?
It really depends on the analyst, I think. So yeah, so if on like whoever's analyzing the data.
Okay.
So I think for the frequency charts, I think they're used as long as they're complete, I'm pretty sure. But I would have to look in that. I'm not sure what they do about the distances and things like that. But I think they're still on there. I mean, you can still certainly see them plotted on the maps.
Yeah.
I think they go into those frequencies on the maps, but I'm not totally sure about that. Or they might just sort the ones of these that actually have like distance or duration and use those ones for that. But yeah, so for my stuff, I've mostly used all complete checklists that are more than 2 or 3 species. So it would use all the historical ones. But that's mostly what I was dealing with historic population change. So I really wanted these older checklists. So yeah, so incidental, that's something if you're, if you just see a bird while you're driving down the road, something cool, and but you think it should still be made note of and put it into the database. So that's what incidental's for. Or, yeah, I mean, a lot of kind of casual feeder watching. If you don't really have a complete list, you just want to put some stuff in from your feeder, that's a good place to do it. And then there's all these other more specialized protocols.
So is incidental, do they ask for start time or anything at all, or do they incidental?
I think incidental is just start time. I don't think it's mandatory though. So yeah, you don't even need to have start time or party size. Just the date.
Just the date. Okay.
Yeah.
How specific do you have to be for that? Like if you're driving to Halifax and you and there's black butterflies over the road, but you're somewhere between Shelburne and Bridgewater.
I mean, it's as close as you can get. It's the best. I mean, you can enter, anything entered at the county level is automatically disqualified. It's just invalidated right off the bat. But so anything with slightly more detail than that is acceptable. But yeah, county level.
Highway, you count those kilometer markers. Is it fine to say near kilometer 185? Or
Sure, yeah, definitely.
that pretty well gives you an area. So.
Yeah, it's
Mark's idea, with the owls on the highway,
Yeah, that's right, the kilometres.
44, man.
So they're not actually where they are, because I can't see them on the map.
So where did you put
But
the
they're
owls that
estimated.
you saw on the highway? How did you put it in? Yeah.
When you do your checklist, you just add a sign.
I do, I
The map
did
comes up.
incidental, because I'm driving back home from work. I just noticed it on
Yeah,
the,
it's
so I
in-
put it
yeah.
as
So if
incidental.
you're at kilometre 44, say, you make a checklist, you open the map, you zoom in, and then you put
Put
a
incidental.
dot on the highway and call it kilometre 44, Highway 103. And then, even if you're not actually on the map there, it doesn't matter. You're calling it that place. You're within a couple of kilometres, probably. And we've got owls all over the place.
yeah, they're a ton right now. Coming out of the woods.
The custom ones, what have you got in there?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different ones.
I've never heard of it before.
Yeah. So they used to have area count as one of the major ones. So if you went into a small park and or maybe your yard and you think you covered every single inch of that place and didn't miss any birds, then you put it in there as a census and you have the area you covered instead of the distance. There's a banding protocol for people that are doing bird banding.
Submit their stuff via EBird.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, there's tons of it in there. So but for banding, you can only mark it complete if you're recording other things that you didn't band, so things you heard while you were banding too, or other things that you saw. Otherwise, it's supposed to be incomplete if it's just the banded birds.
Visible migration and sea watching.
There is I don't think there are a few funny water bird count ones. I don't think there is a special sea watching one though.
When I did my own checklist from Quebec, I got J days, which happen when I would get 7,000 J's.
Yeah.
And of course it gets flagged because it's too many J's and we only get 15 in that area. And there was no way of actually marking it as part of visible migration, maybe a 6 or 7 hour watch counting all the J's. And it's the same with sea watching. There's something called Trent. Are you aware of that?
No.
It's a Scandinavian thing. They're using it a lot in the UK, and they use it for sea watching. And the interface is such that you can enter the things because they're going past and in detail how many there were, which way they were going, flock sizes, that type of stuff. It's worth taking a look at.
Huh, neat.
And if there was an interface like that, then when you wanted to do a visible migration watch or a sea watch, you wouldn't keep getting these flags saying you can't see 250 razorbills.
Right.
I know it's kind of annoying, but those still will get passed as long as you just
Oh, yeah, yeah.
stuff. So Hot Ridge, all of their stuff goes on EBird. There's a lot of really
But if you've got if the thing was there and you didn't have to keep writing going south, going east, going west, if you could plot what was happening on a checklist when you put it in rather than have to write it in, then it would be recorded in the data better, wouldn't it? 'Cause you don't
Yeah.
like that thing that had us out last year.
Right.
Crazy how you record that.
How do you process that? Can you click on one of those just to see what options?
Sure, well, yeah, I can click
You
on
use that
the
one,
pelagic protocol.
yeah.
So it has the normal things, but then there's this, so you can please understand the full protocol. So you would click on that, and then there's a write-up of that protocol type.
So that's where the nocturnal protocol is.
That's where the nocturnal is.
Just ignore that.
Yeah, well, they actually say that the nocturnal thing, if you're actually doing nocturnal flight calls, they want to make, there's a certain protocol for that. But otherwise, it's more of just something to get your attention, to make sure you're not making a mistake, like doing AM instead of PM or
The
something.
single out in the yard is
Yeah. But it will flag anything, between sunset and sunrise as a nocturnal count, just to be sure. Ideally, they kind of like you to split off things. I think if you start birding before twilight, like if you're doing a big day and you're owling, and then you start birding after that, to try and break it up and keep the strictly nocturnal stuff separate. But that's ideally. I don't think too many people do that. But yeah, so there's all this stuff for the pelagic protocol. So you start recording 2 miles from shore. Like anything within 2 miles just goes into like something for that harbor, a near shore list. And after that, like every hour, you're supposed to start a new list.
Pelagic data start, how far off?
2 miles.
2 miles?
Yeah. And they actually want you to, each time you start a new list, to record all the same birds over again. Like if there's birds following the boat. I haven't really been doing that just because I want to be able to add up all the lists at the end and get it like an approximate count. So I try and split them up, but I don't know. It's more for, I don't know why they do that way. I guess you did technically see it way out at sea if it was following the boat. So.
If you go out and you say do 15 checklists, I mean, we've had lots of checklists, I think it would be good to be able to produce a cumulative at the end.
Right.
That summarises everything from all the checklists into one, just as a data readout, if not something to submit.
Right.
So you could go back to it and say, oh, we saw 600 bleached.
Yeah, you can still do that, but it's a little bit of a pain. But, but yeah, so I'll show you that in just a second. But anyway, so there's all these details about all these different protocol types if you want to use one of those.
Is that for the recreation count?
Could you go to the banding
I pulled together all
Sure,
all
yeah.
these points. It's in the reports.
So is that
And you pick off your...
recorded by the station or by a person?
For the day. And then it
Is
accumulates everything.
well, let's see. I mean, my guess is it's probably, if it's technically for the station, including things that the individual birder didn't see, it should be like a separate eBird account just for that station. So I'm guessing that's probably what most of them do. And then each individual birder, they might have that list shared with them and then just cut out things they didn't see.
For my remote nocturnal, I don't do it in my name, but in the name of a different account for the station.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely supposed to be that way for the nocturnal flight calls.
So you think it's the same way for banding?
I think so, yeah.
So
Yeah, I think this is where it's getting into it here. Create a separate account when you enter banding records.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there one for BP or SEAL? I don't remember ever seeing it.
I don't think so. Yeah, I think they just put in their own checklists. But anyway, so that's only really important when you're out banding. But any of those other specialized checklists anyone wants to look at?
Random?
Yeah, so that's just, they were pushing that for a while, just to have these random locations that you would just go to in Bird, just to kind of like fill in the gaps between hotspots a bit. So they're making a push for that for a while. I haven't heard much about it recently, but. All right, well, anyway, let's go back to Swim's point. I'm not going to do a real checklist. So say 3 p.m. That one time I was probably there for 20 minutes.
You got there in 10 past 2.
Yeah, but that's when I got back there. When I actually made a checklist. But, so I made the checklist on my phone. This is an eBird app. So these are the different things I saw. There's 2 Brant. I'm not going to fill out the whole list right now, but I think there were 8 mile. The tufted duck was there. So that's a good one to go for, because if you look through this list, so you get down to the scaup and there's no tufted duck. So you're like, well, I saw a tufted duck there. So a lot of people, they just look at the list and might put in, say, duck spa or atheist spa or something, just to try and put it under some placeholder. But it has over here this show rarities box. So you click on that and it shows all the rare birds that have been reported in the county ever. So you get down here and then you actually do have tufted duck. So if you put in a rare bird,
Okay, yeah, I had problems with that.
yeah, so if I were to go, say that's all I had and push submit, it's going to say, okay, this needs a bit more information. Because anything marked as rare, you're going to have to put in details for. The same if you put in a really high count of a species, it seems exceptionally high, it'll also trigger it details. So if you have a photo, you can just drag the photo right in here from your computer. I don't know, there's probably some way to do it on the phone, but maybe not. I guess you have to get on the computer first, unless you're taking a picture of the back of your... Yeah. Or you can write in the details of the bird here, like it was a female, you know, it was continuing. I'm not going to write all the details in now, but...
Where did you see it took to the
I saw it, it was looking between the piers. It wasn't with the scope, but it was in kind of behind, diving and feeding back in there. So set up the scope on it, just watching it for a bit. And you can enter more information here about each individual sighting, so that we can put the age or the sex in. There's breeding codes, so if it's during the breeding season, if you have, if you're like doing breeding bird atlasing, or if you found a bird nest, you could put it in here. And then also in here is this flyover code, which is the only one you really use outside of the breeding season. But if you're anywhere birding and you want to record something as a flyover, because it's not really using that habitat, just something you saw just fly over, you can use this breeding code, even though it wasn't really breeding. But so anyway, that duck was not a flyover. So.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, because I was in the woods the other day, and 7 Canada geese flew over. It's not Canada geese habitat where I'm birding.
Right.
I count them as 7 Canada geese, right?
Right, but you're supposed to, everything you see.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine to put it in without flyover, but any extra detail that goes in there can always be used down the road. But I mean, if you don't put it in there, then it's just kind of lost. So.
Any intention to expand the number of ages you can apply to an individual? Because when you put a gull in...
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I don't know. I've never heard anyone ask that one, so I'm not sure if they're looking into that or not. But yeah, it could be really useful.
If it's a structure for the checklist just for gulls or whatever species got 2, 3, 4 years to maturity, couldn't...
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's something they should definitely put in there.
I forget what he said, but it didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
You're looking at 500 gulls.
Right.
Yeah, but when you look at one individual gull and you're aging it, if you look at it, say you've got 4 lesser blackback gulls and they're all specifically different ages, and you want to find out what the spread of age range is, unless you separate them out, you're not going to be able to do it.
It would be quite useful to have for photos.
Right.
You can search for a specific age of gull.
Someday.
So after you push complete, if you want to share it with somebody else, where do you go?
Yes, I'll show you that in just a second. I just wanted to show one more thing on here before I would like submit the list. So you could also include subspecies. So you can click on this to show the different subspecies. So this is really useful to keep track of certain things. Like if you saw, like a common teal, European green-winged teal, you might want to put that in there. It only has American on there. They have rarities, which should have the common teal. But
when you download your data, can you download it to subspecies level?
If you download your own data?
Yeah, so let's say you put things in for another country and you're in different areas, so you've got different subspecies of one species. If you download your data, will it?
I think it should have it, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you download the whole data set, it definitely has the subspecies in there. So I think if you do your individual download, it will have it as well. And then there's a few other types, like domestic type mallards. There's some hybrids in here too. Yeah, so there's the Eurasian green-winged teal, the common teal. I would say, if you are going to use subspecies, just not to use the default one for the area unless you actually did identify to that subspecies. It's one thing that a lot of birders do. It's kind of my pet peeve. There's so many, American herring gulls and all these things. I know people that were doing it. I mean, some people do actually identified it to that subspecies, but a lot of people would just assume it's the local subspecies and put it in there. When people do that, then you don't really get a sense of how common that subspecies is in relation to the rare subspecies or ones from out of range that might show up from time to time. Like say, red-shafted flicker, when that comes here, if everyone's always putting in yellow-shafted, even if they didn't actually know that it's yellow-shafted, they just heard it, then you wouldn't really know how common red-shafted is, just as everyone. Yeah, I mean, myrtle warbler, they sound, they do sound different, so. I mean, you can ID them by the call notes and by the song. But yeah, I would say so. I wouldn't assume anything or put in any assumptions, like only things that were identified positively. All right, so I'm going to submit this list. I don't really know why, but just so I can show you what it looks like. I'll edit it later because I have it on my phone. So I only had a couple species on there. So it's submitted. You can look at it, make any necessary changes. And then if you want to share it with somebody that you're birding with, so sharing is for other people with eBird accounts. Share it into their account. It's not necessarily, like sometimes I've had other eBirders share a checklist with me just because they wanted to show me what they saw. That's different. That's like if that's the email, you would email yourself the checklist, then send them that email, a list of what you saw. Some people think that's sharing. The sharing is really if you were birding together, you don't want to duplicate the data in the database. So you just share the checklist so it comes from both people in the party. So yeah, share with others in the party. Then you would just type in either their email or their username. So just if you would have to know that or ask them for their username or their email to get to share it with them. And so then it has a list of contacts, like all the people I've shared lists with are down here. So you could just select somebody from that list once you've put them in there.
It would be nice when you share checklists, when it returns to the checklist interface, if it showed on that checklist who you'd shared it with.
Right, yeah.
That would be really useful.
Yeah, it doesn't show until they accept it, yeah.
So when you accept the shared list, it automatically goes on your list?
It automatically goes into your account, and then you have the option of going through and finding any species that maybe you personally didn't see, but like the other person in your party saw, and you can take those off and vice versa, just to fine tune it to the things that you actually saw. Okay, so once your lists are submitted, you can, so just go into My eBirds. This is one of the main tabs from the beginning. So there's Submit, Explore, we've looked at those two. Then there's this My eBirds. This is where it keeps track of all your lists. And so it has data from different states or provinces. I can sort it by counties, like that, or countries or other major regions in the world or wherever. And then there's a few tabs over here. So we were talking about that day trip. Like if you were out on a pelagic all day, you could get a summary where it will add them all together by doing this. Unfortunately, it doesn't have day trip on here, which is really annoying. But you can just pick a date starting with that particular day. And then you can pick all the locations where you were birding that day that you want to include.
Just under the locations, on my eBird, and you might have seen it, I prefix every location I've got with NS. Because that way, if I want to find it from my list, I only go to the one that says NS and not the couple of thousand other locations I've birded in. It'd be really useful if eBird, when it created a checklist with the location, automatically prefixed the province, state, at the beginning instead of the end, and then it would alphabetically.
Yeah, it's funny because in some places in the database it is like that. So I mean, if you look at, so I mean, I can't remember. If you pull up a hotspot, like the hotspot's name, I think officially starts with like CA for Canada, and then NS, and then that other stuff. So if you've duplicated that, then it has that in there twice. But yeah, it is a great way to sort checklists. I wish they did it like that. They really should. I think that part of the page is something that really needs a lot of work. But anyway, so if you did want to get a day list, you would just pick that from whatever locations you birded that day, and I'll just highlight all of them. I don't think those are all the same day, but this is different parts of the week. And you hit continue, and so it'll show you what you saw each day, the total number of species, the number of individuals. So this is the high count on each checklist. If you want to get an actual total that you had during that day, you would hit this species totals. So like this is what I do after like the Christmas bird count. I'll put all the lists in. I'll take this, and then you can just. I think there's a way you can just download. I just miss it on there. Yeah, you can just download the report and get a little spreadsheet with everything, your species totals. So that's also what I do for the pelagic trips.
That's where I've had the problem with the average count.
Yeah.
Because if I'm like trying to do a summary of my nocturnal observations, for the week. Any period that has a 0 doesn't get included in the average count. So
Right.
it distorts the mean number of birds. You see what I mean?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm not sure how to get around that exactly, but
I've tried. I don't think there is.
yeah. Wait, so there's manage your checklist, so it's just a list of your different checklists. You can go, and this is another way you can share it. You can find that checklist and just hit share, and just bring that share page up right away.
With John's question, what would happen if you put 1 instead of 0?
Well, yeah, no, because then it would just kind of be, because you'd have to actually put it in the checklist, like you saw one of those, or you heard one of those flying over that night, but you actually didn't. So, yeah, no, I think there's probably better to download the raw data and deal with it yourself, probably in a spreadsheet, the way that needs to be done. Yeah, because it's pretty limited what they do right there. I think they are going to upgrade that pretty soon, but yeah, I've been waiting for that for years, but it hasn't happened yet. Anyway, so those are all the checklists if you need to go in or view or edit any of them. And then there's manage my locations is that other. So if you needed to suggest something as a hotspot after the fact, you could go through all these checklists. And like, I don't have a good naming system for mine because I use my phone a lot, so mine are just a disaster if you want to find anything. So yeah, I basically have to find it some other way, and then go in here and you can type in the name and find it that way. So that's usually what I have to do. If I like, oh, that hotspot, or that should be a hotspot, like where is it? I know I have a checklist from that location, and find it and just type in the name and then put it in there, suggest it as a hotspot. So if you were gonna pick, say, this one point, you could pick edit. Oh, it's somebody else's. So if somebody else owns it, you can't do much to it. You can give it your own name. So this one's owned by Ken McKenna. Let's say I do that one. So yeah, so you can edit your hotspots or your personal locations this way. You can move it. You can move the location. You can't move a hotspot unless you're a hotspot editor. You can't move you might show it differently on your own though if you did move it, but it won't move the official location. So yes, you can rename it. You can move it. You can merge it with a hotspot. So if someone made a hotspot afterwards at a location that you think should be one, you can merge it in. And then you can actually zoom out and find a hotspot. So I can click on that and say yes, merge it with that hotspot. And then this is where you suggest it as a hotspot. All right, I'm taking up too much time here. So, but anyway, so yeah, now there's a free phone app for entering checklists. It's the eBird app. It's really easy to use. You can and it tracks everywhere you go while you're birding, which is really nice. So it's super simple. It's all the same protocols. I do almost all my lists with it now. I used to always do it in a notebook, but now I just do it on the phone as I go. There's a lot of shortcuts. You can just type in part of a species name and it automatically jumps to the species. It's pretty smart in picking them out.
Does your location have to be on?
Yes. But you don't have to have service to use it. You can.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, as long as you have your GPS, you can do an offline checklist, then pick the location later when you get back to Signal or Wi-Fi. Okay, so once all these lists come in, it goes through the review process. And so there's a number of reviewers in Nova Scotia. So these are lists, these are individual records that come through. So everything goes through a filter first. So if you submit a checklist, we'd have to go through, we have a separate filter for each county in Nova Scotia. So here's the Yarmouth one, I'll just look at that one.
How often do you review filters?
Well, if I'm going through and reviewing records and I see something, it's like it's not really rare, I should deal with that. And I'll just go into the filter right then and just change it. So I do that a lot. I don't often go into the whole filter and look at everything and try and change things. But if I see reports coming in, especially if it happens a few times in a row, and I'm like, okay, I need to change that.
It doesn't have a knock-on effect because I asked Dave about catbird last year when we had the fallout. The year before when we had the fallout, catbirds were all through the winter, the 4, 5, 6 in most places. But it was always a rarity. You always had to add it. So quite a few didn't get added because you forgot. and he said that if you took it off being a flagged species, then it would have a knock-on effect with all the records, so that when it had to be flagged before, it would have had some...
Well, yeah, so you can run, when you change the filters, so if I were to change something in here, then they want you to run them, like to rerun the filter, and it passes all the data from that species, again, through the new filter. Yeah, so I think that's probably what he was getting at.
Yeah, it's not a very good system, is it?
It's...
Because you should be able to do it responsively.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, we have it kind of like an average across a whole bunch of years. So you might have 1 year where there's a gray catbird. I mean, personally, I don't like rerunning the filters because it's a ton of work.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like all that stuff's already been dealt with. I mean, it's one thing. Yeah, I mean, if you're tightening up the filter, if you're loosening the filter, it's different. It doesn't really add too much to your. But if you're tightening the filter, then yeah, you could do a whole bunch of.
From your point of view, you need to be able to take some species out of the filter for a duration period when they're common. And then as soon as they start to get less common, put the filter back on again. So that would make more sense.
Yeah, I mean, some people do that. I mean, it's not, I mean, people see it coming up as rare, but yeah, I guess it depends on how you're entering checklists. Like if you don't see it on the checklist, you might not enter it. But yeah, so it kind of depends on how you look at it. Typically, we don't change it for one particular year if something's common 1 year, but not others.
To changes, like Corey Shearwater. Corey Shearwater was rare, and now the filter's been changed and we can see 400 and you won't flag it.
Right.
So what did that do to the previous records? Did that make them not rare at all when they were?
Well, yeah, now if somebody entered, Corey Shearwater's from the past, like from 20 years ago, yeah, it would not get flagged.
Yeah, you see, so it doesn't work too well, does it? Now?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's hard for things that are really changing and, in abundance, but, it's set to the present. There's not really much around it. So yeah, so we can change the dates, we can change the numbers. These were originally made kind of it looked at the eBird data and it kind of came up with these automatic filters. They were pretty bad because when they did that for Nova Scotia, there wasn't a lot of data, like there just wasn't a lot in eBird yet. So they were pretty sloppy, so they took a lot of work. And they're far from perfect. I mean, there's a lot of problems with them. I'm constantly tweaking the ones that, things I see that are wrong. But overall, they do a pretty good job. So there's not a ton of flagged records. I mean, I think for the most part, things are flagged that should be, and things that aren't. But yeah, there are a lot of things kind of on the border that get flagged that maybe shouldn't, maybe the other way around for some species. But so once it passes through that filter, then it goes into this list. So we go through it. I don't do that much of it these days. I think Dominic and Dave Bell are doing most of it, probably mostly Dominic now, at least as for the province as a whole. And you're a reviewer for a couple counties. Yeah, we have, and then Dave McCorkadale does Cape Breton. There's 4 counties up there. Ken's on there for a couple counties. So yeah, so we have lots of help.
Who's our reviewer?
There's no like specific reviewer for Yarmouth or Shelburne counties. So one of us would deal with those records, like me, Dave, or Dom. Well, now Dave's out in British Columbia, so I'm not sure he's looking at it a whole lot these days. Anyway, so these are lists that are in there. We don't have much of a backlog right now. I mean, there's a little bit, some old records that people are putting in, and then just a few of these more recent records. And then so also people that, if they see a photo that they think is misidentified in the eBird data set, they can flag it, then it automatically pops it back into our review queue if they say that. I don't think anybody can do that now, is that right? Is it open to the public where anyone can? I think you have to enter 365 lists in a year or average that, and then you can review photos.
Yeah. That's what they set it at anyway.
Yeah, eventually I think they're going to open it up to everybody, but it hasn't happened quite yet. I know, it can be a mess. Anyway, so that's what the review looks like.
But only you can see that, right?
Only the reviewers, yeah, can see this normally.
Yeah, you're peeking behind the curtain right now.
Yeah. And then, so here are the hotspots. So these are the hotspot requests. So like a lot of people for some reason, they will put a hotspot in there that's already there. So like Lawrencetown Provincial Park, I mean, that must be a hotspot already, right? So, so these are kind of easy to deal with. So we go in here, say, oh yeah, so that's the same one. So you could just push merge and merge it with that hotspot that's already there. And so it just lumps their location in with that one. So a lot of them are like that. So there's all these other lists, but a lot of them are kind of things, well, I don't know what half of them are, but so they have to be named pretty well. We'll try and go through them periodically and add everything, but
Hostile.
yeah, so like hostile, I don't know what that is. Okay, so that's the review. So I'm taking up a lot of time here. How are you guys doing? Everybody hanging in there? So I just wanted to show you a few more things, like if you're planning a trip somewhere, these two things can be pretty useful, target species and alerts. Like I'm going to Costa Rica in February, so these target species are pretty handy. So you can type in a region, and you can pick a time of year, so you could either custom fit it to when you're going there, but in Costa Rica, a lot of the birds are kind of resident there, especially the ones that I need to see, so I'm just going to do year-round so that all the rare stuff will be in there. And so then you can pick which listing region you want. So I'm not really interested in my Costa Rica list. I want to know for my world life list which species I can see on this trip. And then so it automatically sorts them by how common they are. So these are the most common species in Costa Rica that I haven't seen yet. And you can just go on down the list and see. And then these all link into their species profiles. So you can look at that. You can look at the map, although, so you can see where you need to go to see it. You can look in even more closely and see which hotspots they're seen at to find specific locations where you could go to see that species.
Can you make a list of species, then download all the calls to an MP3?
No.
Does that make sense?
But they do have a new app in Costa Rica that I just got. That's pretty sweet. It's like that feel good one. Yeah, I like it. It's getting better. They're adding a lot of stuff to it. So like last year when I went, the app was hardly any good, but this year it's like a lot more stuff in there. It has like all the calls. Yeah. And then these needs alerts are pretty useful too. For Costa Rica, it might be a little bit excessive if I were to put that on there. It'd just be so many species. But if you're going, I'm also kind of planning a trip to Arizona where I've been quite a few times. There aren't too many things I haven't seen in Arizona. So you can also subscribe to these alerts too. So I have a few subscriptions, like Rare Birds in Nova Scotia. I get an hourly update. Anything that trips the filter, where the filter's set at 0, and if somebody reports that species, then I get an email about it. So that's for these rare birds. Same as things I haven't seen this year in my home county, Kings County. I get an email about that if somebody sees one of those. But then if you're traveling, so if I were going to Arizona, then I could either put this in for rare birds in Arizona, so anything that trips the filter in that particular state, or I could do things that I haven't seen in Arizona. But these ones, and then you can pick if you want it to be for your year list or just for your life list for that area. And so these are just reports in the past week, so observations for the last 7 days. So this is really useful if you're actually going to that place really soon or in that location. You can see what people are seeing that you haven't seen. I think I picked it from my Arizona life list, not my real life list. So it has a ton of stuff.
You saw snow wolves too?
What's that?
Snow wolves in Arizona?
They have them there. I haven't seen them there, but anyway, so that's that in a nutshell. It's most of the useful things you can do with eBird, and then I'll show you the data that I've been working with. Actually, I'll just show you right here. There's also this. It's not in here now. They've moved everything around, so I think it's in this science section. So they have all these new science products that just came out. I might as well just show it now since I'm here. So yeah, so this they just changed. They've been using a lot of habitat data, like from satellite imagery, to kind of link that to eBird observations over the course of a year. So they've come up with all these animations for different species over the course of a year. And there's a whole bunch of, this just came out about a month ago, so there's a lot of new information here. So they're now using, they used to just use presence-absence data, but now they've incorporated the count data in here too. So this is like an animation of wood thrushes throughout the course of a year. So the date's right there. So it's taking mostly the real eBird data into account, and it's like interpolating in areas where they don't have data based on the habitat.
I'm flying over the bill from Mexico and assuming.
Yeah. Definitely. And so there's a lot of other things you can look up. And so they're just starting to do these trends. So I've been working on using eBird data to do trends a lot. So they only have this for 2 species available right now, the trends. But they're looking at trends in each of these little, grid cells. They're going to try and say whether it's, increasing or decreasing in that area. So they're only using a pretty limited amount of data, 2007 to 2016. Because they can't go too far back in time to get that much data for each of those cells. But this is what they're showing for wood thrush. So,
and that's just for the States?
well, this is for, it's where they have data. Yeah, so it goes into Canada. This is all in Canada here. Okay. So it's pretty pale there. So it's like not much change. And then the size is based on how common they are there. So this is kind of like the core of their breeding range. It's where these biggest circles are. So they're pretty much declining in the core of their range, but then in some areas in the periphery, like they seem to be increasing over here. Relatively stable in some areas in this part. So let's go back to the science. I haven't used it a whole lot since they changed it. But yeah, so they have this download eBird data products. So all the data are open access. You can fill out a little basically permission form, and then you can download the data, the raw data, and use it. It's huge. It's like really difficult to deal with unless you're doing like a small time frame or area. So like when I download it, there's no way you can open it in a spreadsheet. You have to like export it into some SQLite database or something, and then deal with it and just query it, just the things that you need.
You mentioned something about habitat earlier. Is there habitat data?
They do have habitat data for, I think, just the US. So that's this eBird reference data set. Yeah. It says North America and South America. So yeah, they've changed this around a little bit. They had really fine scale data for the US. Now I think they're using a little bit coarser. Maybe it probably says in here, I don't know, maybe it's like 10 by 10 kilometer grids for habitat. And not as much. I don't know, you'd have to look into it very carefully to see, but yeah, but they do have the habitat data in there for the Americas.
And you have any idea what kind of categories they have? Habitat?
Well, I can't remember off the top of my head. It was probably 4 years ago when I was looking at it in depth, and it's changed since then a bit. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Is it is it like forested or beach forest?
I think the stuff for the U.S. was very detailed, but then I think it's slightly different imagery in Canada. So I think the one that they use for all across the Americas is a bit coarser, and I don't think it has species-specific stuff at all. Yeah, I think I'm not sure. I don't know. Have you looked into it at all? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I didn't use any of the habitat data for the models I've done. So, all right, so I'm going to switch over. If you guys have a little bit more patience to talk about my work. Where's the start slide? All right, so I was working on a project for about 3 years on using eBird data to model long-term population change of migratory bird species. So we no one had really done it yet. We really wanted to go in and see if the eBird data was useful, like if there was enough of it going back in time to model population change. Overall, I'd say it was pretty successful. This is something I was working on with Phil Taylor at Acadia University. And so this is American tree sparrow. This goes back quite a ways. It's 1925. There's some pretty big error bars. I didn't put them on there because it's pretty messy. But and these are 3 seasons, so spring, fall, and winter. So you see overall the data, these are all independent data sets. We've cut off the date ranges, so they're completely separate checklists. They're all showing more or less the same pattern going back in time. So it's pretty encouraging. So we started out, we really just wanted to develop different techniques to extract population trends from the noisy eBird data set. There's quite a few issues with the data set compared to others. There's observer bias, of course. There's really good bird watchers. There's completely beginners, and it's fine. It's all in there. It just has to be dealt with. There's a lot of geographic bias and bias over time, because eBird was launched in 2002, so it's grown exponentially since. So there's tons of checklists from recent times, very few from earlier times, so it's a really imbalanced data set. And also there's a lot of geographic bias, because on several scales, like birders go birding in spots where they think they're going to see birds. Bird watchers bird a lot in their yards and at feeders. And bird watchers bird where there's people, where there are more birders. So you can see, like in the past, like older checklists tend to come from like high population centers, like that. So areas with lots of people. So that all has to be dealt with when doing these models. You can't just put the raw data in there and look at it, how frequent birds are by year, because it would just be a mess. So yeah, so like I said, it's non-random, unbalanced, all these potential issues to deal with. So the first thing we wanted to do was just kind of focus on a really relatively small area. So we knew that like the geographic range wouldn't have a huge effect on it. Like most birds in that area should be more or less following the same patterns. We focused on southern Ontario because there were a lot of data from there. There's like Toronto and like a lot of, there's Long Point, Point Pelee, just lots of data in this one area. Also, Phil is from this area, so he grew up there birding. He's kind of known how the bird species have changed over time in that area, so we kind of knew what things should look like for some species. And I was also pretty familiar with that area too. I've spent some time there. My wife's from Ontario, so I bird in that area a lot. So we wanted to kind of compare it to the breeding bird survey in that same area to make sure that they're showing more or less the same thing. I mean, breeding bird survey could have some bias too. It's all road-based. There's a lot of potential issues with that, but it's still our best data source for most birds in North America. So we looked back to the beginning of breeding bird survey, which is 1970, more or less when it started. There were a few surveys before that, but it really started in earnest in 1970, and looked through 2015 for our comparison. We picked 22 species that reached the northern edge of their range in this area so that we could just look at breeding data, not have it be kind of polluted with migrants that went through that area that bred further north. And so there was 42 BBS routes in this area we had to compare to. For effort, because we wanted to include a lot of the older checklists, like a lot of these were missing things like distance or even time that it was started, all this stuff. Basically, it was just a list of species. We decided just to use the number of species on a checklist as the degree of effort. We looked into this a bit more, or pretty thoroughly, using these other metrics to see how they would work. And even if you do have all those other things, like if you have the duration, you have the distance. When we talked about how there could be errors in distance, definitely duration, people do things differently. The number of species actually was the best metric of effort anyway. We only use presence-absence data, also for the same reason, just because there were a lot of checklists that were missing count data from the past. Then we used some statistical models to fit these in R. And for our main fixed effects that we wanted to, that error we wanted to account for, were date. So like we used a quadratic term, since most of these species peak at some point as they're migrating into the area and breeding, and then start to decrease in frequency. So we use a quadratic term, and then we use the different protocol types in an interaction with the number of species, because depending on how you're birding, you might accumulate species at a different rate if you're traveling or stationary or historical. So we had those effects in there. And then we also included some random effect terms for observer. So each different observer was modeled separately for each species. So to speak, how often each person observed that species and reported it. So it's highly variable. So we could account for that. And then we also used the location. So we took all the personal locations, like a lot of them only had one checklist, and we just grouped those to the nearest hotspot. So we'd have locations that had quite a few checklists that we could estimate for that general area. And so these are some of our results. We had a few ways of breaking up the season. And all these ones, the breeding bird survey is going to be on the right. That's that. And then we looked at just Point Pelee. These are this ones on the left. It's had a whole bunch of checklists. Then we didn't have to deal with any of the location stuff at all, just to see what that looked like, if Point Pelee was reflective of the rest of that part of the province.
EBird data from Point Pelee?
Yeah, EBird data from Point Pelee. Then we used that whole Southern Ontario region just in the breeding season. But for a lot of species, that wasn't quite enough in June and July. Like a lot of checklists come from May and April. Like a lot of birders are out then. So this is including April and May too. So just as birds are coming in and the breeding season. So in theory, we shouldn't really have any migrants that are passing through the area because it's all species that are at the northern edge of the range. So we were hoping we could use that migration data too. And so for species that were declining, so these are all species that showed declines in breeding bird survey, we wanted to look at them differently to make sure the eBird data could pick up either declines or increases. So for declining species, it did pretty well. So 10 out of the 14 species we looked at were positively correlated. It picked up these really strong trends in eastern meadowlark. Picked up all this stuff pretty well. There were a few species that had opposite trends, or two. Baltimore oriole and brown-headed cowbird. You can see eBird showed them both increasing, and breeding bird survey had decreases for both. I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. I think it's probably feeder bias, especially for the orioles. I think feeding orioles became popular during this time, like feeding them oranges. And I also know like they started feeding orioles at Pelee during that time at the visitor center. Like a lot of these checklists actually come from Point Pelee. So I think that could account for the Baltimore oriole. Cowbird is a little bit more complicated. I mean, it could still have something to do with feeders, or perhaps there could also be some habitat shift thing going on. I'm not really sure what could happen, but that whole area was mostly agricultural. During that time frame, it went kind of from smaller farms into like large-scale industrial farms where it's not as friendly for birds. There's a lot less waste grain around. They could be potentially moving into suburban habitats and taking advantage of bird feeders, so that could cause a pattern like that. Anyway, we're not really sure what was going on with those two species, but for most of them, it looked pretty good. So here are increasing species. 4 out of the 6 were positively correlated. So you can show they mirror these increases pretty well. With the 2 that weren't correlated were these 2, blue-gray gnatcatcher and blue-winged warbler. And the reason they weren't correlated is because in breeding bird survey, in the first half of the survey, they didn't pick up these birds because they were so rare, but eBird did. So in this case, I think probably the eBird data are better than the breeding bird survey data. And that was what led to the negative correlation, but it doesn't mean that the eBird data were bad. And so we had just a couple species in there that were more or less stable. They didn't show any clear increase or decrease in the breeding bird survey, and the same was true for the eBird data. There was just a lot of variation around the line, no real clear pattern. And so if you take those annual indices that we had of occurrence and then run a trend line through them, and we could compare that to the trends from breeding bird survey, we correlated those trends. They were pretty strongly correlated at 0.72, and then this is like a graph. Like ideally, they would be right on this line. This is 1-to-1, but for the most part, they follow this pattern. Like there's not a bunch of birds in these areas, which would be bad. So we thought it was pretty encouraging. Our first crack at the data. So we wanted to look at some of these effort things a little bit more carefully and look at counts of birds too, and see if those data were important. So it's another project just looking at the past 20 years of data, where there's a lot more data to look at, and a lot more data with effort and with counts. And we used exactly the same checklists, like any ones that didn't have any of those, count data or effort data we just got rid of, just so we'd have exactly the same data set, just with or without count. Well, actually, it's just with or without counts. We still decided to get rid of the other effort terms because a lot of them were missing that early on. So this is really just to look at count. So over the past 20 years, we focused on 2 bird conservation regions, the lower Great Lakes, so Ontario and New York mostly were in those, and then the New England Atlantic Coast bird conservation regions. These were areas that they had the same bird species, and they had the most numbers of checklists in those areas, so we had a lot of data to work with. So yeah, so we tested these other effort metrics. They weren't really useful, but then so we compared them. So it overall did pretty well. So it's hard to read this. Breeding bird surveys, these ones. This is BCR 30, and then this is the count, and these are occurrence, so counts and occurrence. So the top one's Carolina wren. Overall, the BBS showed the same as both count and occurrence. So these are all species where it didn't really matter if we used count or occurrence data. They all showed more or less the same pattern for these species. And they all kind of picked up these patterns in abundance. This is ring-necked pheasant, pretty steady decline in all those areas, and turkeys are on the increase thanks to reintroduction programs. But then there were a lot of species where the counts performed better than the occurrence models. And so these are showing some of those. So it's the same thing. It's breeding bird survey here. These are the count data, and these are the occurrence data. So this is an American crow. You can see it shows a slight increase with this real strong pattern. This is the occurrence data. It shows a really strong increase, but when you kind of neutralizes that when you use the counts. Kind of the same thing going on here. It's this crow in the other bird conservation region. So it showed an increase if you just use occurrence data, but then the counts kind of corrected for that. Bluebird, bluebird perhaps, it's hard to say, maybe the occurrence data was a bit better than the count data for that one. And then this is house sparrow, so it's declining in count data in breeding bird survey, but increasing in occurrence. One thing we noticed when we were doing this, was really interesting, like a lot of species had this dip. And at first I thought there was some sort of crazy sampling bias that I couldn't figure out. Does anyone want to take a crack at it? Know what that might be?
What's the year?
It's 2005. It's West Nile virus. That's what it is. So yeah, so I think it took out the crows. It showed really clearly. But then there was quite a few other species that aren't really known to be affected by West Nile that showed that same pattern, like eastern bluebird. So that's something I want to pursue further. I think there's probably something there, some evidence for a lot of different species that were affected by it. Okay, so all that we were really trying to get at is how these Arctic and boreal breeding species in Canada are doing. So we wanted to know if we could use eBird data to model their populations. Because most of those species, they breed so far north that there's no good way to track them. They're too far north for breeding bird surveys. There's just no people up there. Some of them show up on Christmas bird counts, but a lot of them are neotropical migrants, so there's not really good data for the winter either. So we're really curious. So basically all we really know about them is from the limited breeding bird survey data, and then a little bit of stuff from from banding operations, like banding observatories with long-term data sets. So we picked 28 species. Most of them are boreal. We picked a few reference species, just that we kind of thought we'd have an idea of what they were doing. We wanted to see also how far back in time we could take the eBird data and get any kind of credible trends. So pre-1970, we had to band it into 3-year intervals to get enough data for each of those time periods. So yeah, we used different seasons, spring and fall, and then we also had winter for those species that wintered in North America. And we used a very similar model structure to what we did in Southern Ontario. We did use occurrence for these because we were going so far back, we didn't have count data for a lot of stuff. And like a lot of these species aren't big flocking species anyway, some of them are, but so quadratic date interaction, we pinned this with latitude because we were using data from across the range in eBird during migration, so anywhere in North America, so we had to kind of change when they peaked based on the latitude as they migrate through the continent. Instead of modeling each observer separately, we kind of modeled a score for them based on how quickly they accumulated species. So we scored observers, we kind of rated them in some way, and then used that term instead. It's a lot less expensive computationally to do it that way. And then we used a grid cell for our location effects, 20 by 20 kilometer square. So any reports in each of those squares was considered separately based on how common that species was in that square. Then we used Compute Canada resources, some supercomputers to process this because it was too much for our server. Okay, so because we're going so far back in time and comparing these species, or looking at these species where not a lot's known about their trends, we thought by comparing these seasons, it could give us some sort of indication of what was going on, because they're completely independent data sets. So if the spring and the fall and the winter, if they all show the same pattern, that was some indication that the models are doing their work, picking up possibly real trends. We also had a couple reference species. These are two, bald eagle and peregrine falcon. We knew with DDT more or less what they should look like going back in time. So these all tracked pretty nicely between the seasons. So that's bald eagle, they're pretty rare, really bottomed out, and then just have had this astronomical increase since then. And more or less the same for peregrine falcon. It looks like they're maybe starting to peak now. So we had a few other things we wanted to look at. We knew there were spruce budworm data dating way back in time that we could look at to see if species that associated with spruce budworm tracked those outbreaks. And then we did have the BBS data, the breeding bird survey, going back to 1966, and then Christmas bird count going back to the same amount of time. So we could compare that too for the more recent years and see how our models did. So looking at between the spring and fall, we only had winter data for a few of the species. But between spring and fall, they were positively correlated for 22 of 28 species. It's most of them. There are only two negative correlations. One was least flycatcher, which there could be some potential ID issues between spring and fall. In spring they're singing, and fall they're not. So I think there's something going on there. Then for Smith's longspurs, they're species with the least data. They kind of have a really limited wintering range in an area where there aren't eBirders, so there really weren't many data to deal with there. Overall, the correlation coefficient was 0.56, and when you ran a trend through those, it looked pretty tight like that. And these are those two species that had the negative correlations. So here's blue-winged warbler going back in time. You see spring and fall mirror each other really tightly until back around here. So what is that like? It's still only back until around 1960 or so. So maybe there's something going on here. There's a lot of noise, but so 1960 maybe is a good cutoff for that species. Depending how common they are, you might be able to go further back in time. Like white-crowned sparrow, they tracked really well, pretty far back in time as well. But again, it's right around the same time where things start to fall apart. Right around 1950, 1960. So looking at spruce budworm, I was able to get data from the Forest Service or whatever exactly they're called here. I can't remember, but they gave me data on the acreage of spruce budworm outbreaks going back in time. So this is what the outbreak data looked like. These are the three species that are known to really track spruce budworm outbreaks: bay-breasted warbler, Tennessee warbler, and Cape May. And so they all track this outbreak really well. In the 1970s, they're all showing this recent increase with the outbreak that's happening now. Then there was this previous outbreak back in the 50s that you can see really well in bay-breasted, and you kind of get an inkling of it there. But so we ran models for 68 different models for those 28 species. And of those models, the ones that correlated the most with spruce budworm across all years were these budworm species, and then evening grosbeaks, which are also known to be a budworm species, just maybe not quite as much as the others. Then rusty blackbird kind of showed up in there. Not sure why exactly. Perhaps they also track spruce budworm. They're not known to. But also, I would just like to point out, like anything that in this time period showed a really strong decline would also correlate with spruce budworm. So that was one problem we had, but things that also showed this peak correlated better. So that's probably also why rusty blackbird was highly correlated just because they had such a strong decline.
2016,
Yeah.
all those birds were there except for the western blackbird.
Yeah.
And in abundance. Like I'd only seen maybe 2 or 3 tendency warblers here, and I went up there and they were like singing every tree. It was like, wow.
Wow. But yeah, so when we compared our results to breeding bird survey and Christmas bird count, we weren't really expecting strong correlations because we thought that maybe the breeding bird survey wasn't doing a very good job of tracking these birds because most of them breed further north. It turns out we still got pretty strong results. So these are the correlations with the different seasons. With breeding bird survey, in 0.78, that's really strong. 0.92 is very good. 0.6 is pretty good too. And then even Christmas bird count data, they correlated relatively strongly. Then you can show like some of these ones that had very strong declines that we know of, like rusty blackbird. So this is BBS, it's mirrored in EBird data. And Canada warbler shows more or less the same trend as well. Then again, these are these correlations that are for the trends that are pretty close to a straight line. But then there were a couple species that had important contrast to breeding bird survey data. One is blackpoll warbler. This is one that Phil has worked on quite a bit. There's been a lot of concern recently. I don't know if you saw the Partners in Flight kind of status of the birds of North America thing that came out a few years ago, and it said like blackpoll warblers account for 75% of the decline of species in the boreal or something. It's just something completely ridiculous. I mean, breeding bird survey routes cover less than 5% of the range of blackpoll warbler. It's all on the periphery. And so the EBird data shows something totally different. I mean, pretty much all the blackpolls migrate through areas with very high density of eBirders and bird watchers. They go up through Florida, they go through the mid-Atlantic, they go through up here. And eBird shows a pretty different pattern that is something a lot more encouraging. And if you go way back in time, you can see it looks like more or less a stable population, whereas they're showing this doomsday scenario for blackpolls. So that's important because they are currently like funding a lot of blackpoll warbler projects. It's throwing a lot of money at it because they have highlighted this species of conservation concern, where in fact maybe it's not really worthy of that, or some other species might need help a bit more. Kind of similar thing with white-crowned sparrow. Breeding bird survey shows this huge decline, but a very small proportion of their range is covered by breeding bird survey. And eBird data show a pretty steady increase. Then, so for future directions, I'm more or less done with these projects. Although right now, COSIWIC, so that's the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, they're contacting me quite a bit to get eBird models for different species that they're interested in. So I've been just doing those for them, specific species, and then kind of fine-tuning the models based on whatever species they need. Doing that, so they're actually using those in their conservation reports. And then there's this CanBird project, which is just getting going. It's kind of spearheaded in Ontario by Canadian Wildlife Service, but they're really trying to push to get a whole bunch of historic records into eBird to find all these notebooks from bird watchers in the past and try and get all these checklists in there so we can get a better picture of what was happening kind of pre-1970, pre-1960, because really all we know is based on the breeding bird survey. Anything prior to that is all just kind of anecdotal evidence. So it'd be really great to have some actual checklists from back then, or more of them to deal with in these models. And so yeah, so all this work was funded by Canadian Wildlife Service, and then of course all the data came from eBird, Breeding Bird Survey, and Christmas Bird Count, which are all citizen science projects. So it's all citizens that created this data. All right, so that's it. That's a ferruginous hawk. That's one of the species they just asked me to model for them. So.
That's great, thank you. I mean, for somebody who uses eBird, I thought quite a bit. There was a lot on there that I didn't know, so it's very helpful. So are there any questions?
Yeah, I do, but I don't want to take everybody's time. I'll ask you after.
Sure thing.
Well, why don't we do that? We'll let people ask you questions while we have some refreshments that are there.
Can I make a suggestion about refreshments?
Yes.
Can you put a That's also there so people can contribute, otherwise you'll end up paying for it all.
I'm not paying for it, the Bird Society.
Oh, all right.
So you're paying for it from your dues.
All right, that's fine.
But thank you.
You're welcome.
Your dues cover the room rental?
All good.
How about Rondo? You go there sometime?
Rondo? I've been there, but just like once or twice.
Yeah.